Reimagining Creativity. And when I was a little kid, my grandfather and my dad built my sisters and I this amazing treehouse. And this treehouse was a really special place for us to play. There was an upstairs level to the treehouse and a downstairs level. And we loved to play house. And the way the game always worked is that some people would have upstairs, some people would have downstairs. And sometimes one or two people would go find a different place in the yard to build their house. So we would spend a lot of time setting up our houses. And once everybody's house was set up, we would invite each other over. And we would see our houses. And I loved to watch how my sisters would create their houses. And they would always come up with these really intricate designs. Things like whole acorn cap tea sets and flowers hanging from the ceiling. And I thought, oh, she chose downstairs. If I just choose downstairs, my house will look like that next time. So I tried this a few times. If I saw my sister do something really cool upstairs, the next time we would play, I would choose upstairs. And this went on for a few times until I had this moment, and I realized it's not the environment. It's what you do with the space yourself. It's what you bring to the space that allows you to be creative. And maybe this was me as a budding psychologist starting to think about creativity as a construct. And it turns out, I ended up going into the sciences where I study creativity, and my sisters did go into the visual arts. One of my sisters is a costume designer, the other one is a visual artist. So we were all working on our budding creativity through those experiences. And what I have learned through studying creativity is that creativity is a really giant field, and there's lots of different ways that you can think about it. But when you ask a psychologist to give a basic definition of creativity, what they say is creativity is anything that combines novelty and usefulness. Novelty is bringing something new to the table, something that people haven't experienced before. And the usefulness part is solving some kind of problem or helping people think about things in a new way, maybe even evoking emotions that they haven't felt before. But measuring creativity is a really difficult thing to do. And measuring in psychology is different than measuring in the physical fields of science because we don't have things that you can actually put on scales. We just have ideas, abstract concepts that people come up with that help us explain how the world works inside our internal minds. So psychologists have worked on lots of different ways to express what creativity is and how we can measure this. And I'm going to tell you about a few different ways. There's the psychometric approaches where we try to measure specific aspects of creativity. And then there's the processes approaches where we try to figure out what kinds of things do people bring into their thinking when they're engaging in creative activities. And then there's finally the characteristics of creative people. So early psychometric approaches looked at things that you can measure relatively easily. And one of the earliest measures of creativity was a divergent thinking test. Now, divergent thinking is thinking about things differently than other people do. So psychologists came up with what we call unusual uses tests. So they would tell somebody to think of and list out all the uses you can for a brick. So, people would list down maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 things. You could build a wall with a brick, or you could use a brick for a doorstop. And those are not very creative responses, right? Lots of people would think of those responses, but they were looking for those people that would think of lots of different responses and have responses that nobody else comes up with. And those people were labeled as creative because they thought about the world in expansive ways that is different than how other people were thinking about it. So these divergent thinking tests became formalized and have been used in a lot of different settings. But if you think about it, it's not encompassing the whole definition of creativity because it doesn't really tackle that usefulness part, right? It's all about the novelty. So psychologists have thought, well, let's look at other ways that we can think about creativity. And some psychologists really focus on the cognitive approaches. They look for someone who makes creative outcomes, maybe some amazing art or some really innovative science, and they try to study what kinds of things do they put into what kinds of processes occur in their minds as they're engaging in creative thought. And they've come up with some things like analogical thinking, insight, brainstorming, and you can observe these things when people are engaging in creative activities. So I'll give you an example. This is the 9 dots problem. And what you're supposed to do with the 9 dots problem is you're supposed to connect up all of these dots. Not too hard, right? But you're supposed to use only 4 lines, and no line can cross more than 1 dot, or no line can cross a dot more than once. Sorry, let me get this straight. And you can't lift your pencil. So it has to be 4 lines, and they have to be straight lines. So got it? Straight lines. No dot can be intersected more than once. And they have to be only 4 lines, and you can't lift your pencil. Do it in your mind. Everybody have their solution? It's not too hard, right? Well, that's the solution. You actually have to think outside of the box. So that's where that term, think outside of the box, comes from. It's an insight problem. But again, it doesn't explain all of creativity, right? It's somewhat limited in terms of what counts as creativity. So insight is part of it, but it's one cognitive process that we can observe when people engage in creative activity. And there's a lot of other cognitive approaches to measuring creativity, the thinking processes involved in creativity. So people have mapped out creative activities, looking more deeply into the things that people engage in. People engage in a lot of divergent thinking, they do insight problems, but they also do things like incubation. So if you like to try to solve problems while you're in the shower, that's a good example of you being creative, actually. If you like to wake up in the middle of the night with an idea, that is an example of the thinking process that leads to creativity. And so we've identified a lot of different things that contribute to the creative process. But there's also some people that just seem to be more creative than others. And something special is occurring with these people, and some psychologists are really interested in this part. And my research is more in the social cognitive approaches to looking at creativity. So what are the characteristics of creative people? Because I care about fostering creativity in people so that they can use it over and over again. So it's not a single time thing, that it's a practice, a habit of mind. And some of the things that we've identified as social cognitive processes, characteristics of creative people, are things like open-mindedness. You can try to be more open-minded. That seems to be a little fixed in psychology. Also, curiosity, sense of humor, intelligence, and aesthetic sense. Cultivating an aesthetic sense can help you develop your creativity. And then finally, a lot of people talk about risk-taking as important to creativity. And my research, I've really thought about this risk-taking issue. What does it mean to take creative risks? What do people do that allows them to take creative risks? And I'm not talking about risks like drunk driving. That is not a creative risk. I'm talking about the risks where you don't know if the approach you're going to take is going to be fruitful. You're not sure if you're going to have a good outcome or if it's going to be a total failure, but you do it anyway. And that kind of creative risk has really captivated my imagination. And so I've been reading a lot, and what I have found is a lot of people say risk-taking is important, but it's so nebulous in how it's defined in the literature. It seems like it would be straightforward, but it's actually a really underdeveloped construct. So I've been working on trying to identify what risk-taking looks like, how it looks in academic settings, what it looks like for students as they're learning, because I believe that the practices we develop in school help train us to be good thinkers later in our lives. And I've come up with a definition of academic risk-taking, that kind of risk-taking that allows you to be creative in schools. And I've been testing how this works in college students. And so my definition is that academic risk-taking is a willingness and comfort with trying new or challenging tasks and actually engaging in these tasks, not just thinking about engaging in them, but actually doing this. And despite the potential for some undesired consequences like failure. In other words, to make it simpler, it's a willingness and comfort with trying despite risk of failure. And that's something that we can all do better. We can all work on academic risk-taking, I think. And so I've been testing this out, thinking about academic risk-taking. What are the component psychological parts to academic risk-taking? And there's an affective component. This is that anticipatory emotion that you experience when you think about engaging in an academic risk, where you start thinking, but what if I fail? What would happen? And it's that emotional side of your mind where you might even talk yourself out of doing something because you're afraid of failure. There's also a preferred difficulty, this cognitive part where you actually seek out things that are hard for you that you don't already have all the solutions to, that you know that there's room for your own growth in. And then there's the actual action part where you harness that emotion and you strive for that difficulty, so you actually act and try to take the risk. And I've been testing this model in college students, and what I have found is that there are differences by discipline. So if you compare health sciences and engineering, education students, art students, they have different levels of comfort, preferred difficulty, and actions. And you might think, well, who should be the highest up on that? Is it the art students? It's actually the medical science people. So it might be something that is being fostered in some disciplines better than others. And I've also been looking into what predicts academic risk-taking. And people's goals are really important for whether or not they're willing to engage in academic risk-taking. So their goals, whether they're thinking about themselves and their growth, thinking this is something that's exciting for me and I can push myself further, or if they're thinking about, but what if other people see me fail? And when people have that first mindset where they think about, I want to do this because I want to learn more, they engage in more academic risk-taking. And then I've also looked at need for cognition, which is a habit of seeking out things that really engage you cognitively, where you feel like you're doing some mental gymnastics, and that's also a good predictor of academic risk-taking. So these curiosity factors, these personal factors that you can actually control, can contribute to your academic risk-taking. But how does it relate to creativity? Well, I've recently tested this with engineering students at NAU. And when students engage in academic risk-taking, they actually report engaging in creative thinking at higher rates. So more risk-taking, higher levels of self-reported creativity. Actually, 24% of the variance in their creative thinking could be explained by academic risk-taking. And I also tested to see, well, self-report, that's one thing, but what about their instructor reports of their creativity? And academic risk-taking predicts that as well. Academic risk-taking also predicts their grades. So there's some outcomes that are tangible. When people engage in these kinds of risks, they become more creative, and they also are more successful. So my advice, my take-home message is if you really want to foster your creativity, you actually need to worry less about failure and experiment more. You have to go deeply into your subject area, learn a lot, and choose those challenging, exciting pathways forward, and you have to actually let yourself take those risks. Thanks.